Sponsorship. Well, that's really something. In the beginning, when I go back a few years, they used to call the individuals, the new members, were called babies. And after a while, AA started growing. Some people resented the term, so they started calling them pigeons. And then it only took a little while before people that live in New York and places like that didn't like to be called pigeons because, you know, the reputation they have. And so they finally started calling them sponsorees. But really what it is, if we're starting a new way of life, when we come into Alcoholics Anonymous, we start off with a brand new way of life. And so it's always good to have somebody that's been there before to show us the way and lead the way. And the other reason we have problems making decisions, alcoholics, is because we are emotionally handicapped. And anything involving us, we have a terrible time. And so often we have to ask another person's opinion that's not involved in it, and that's where a sponsor comes in, and that helps also. When you think about many of those things that happen, and if you've got a good sponsor, you learn an awful lot. And I can look back, and fortunately or unfortunately, I've been in the program long enough that so many of the individuals have passed away, and I've had to get new sponsors along the way. As one died, another one, I had to pick up another one. But I know some of the things that are with me today I learned in the early days from those sponsors. I recall one time being at a roundup or a conference in Toronto in Canada, and my sponsor at that time happened to be the first delegate from the province of Ontario to the General Service Conference. And he gave his talk, and at the end of the talk he said, "Now are there any questions from the floor?" And there were no questions, one or two perhaps. And he said, "Are there any further questions?" And there weren't any. And so he packed up and we decided to leave. We just get in the car, and right off the bat I start asking questions. And he looked at me and he says, "Don, why didn't you ask those questions when I asked for questions at the meeting?" And I said, "Well, I just didn't want to look stupid in front of all those people." And I've never forgotten what he said. And he said, "Don, a wise man asks questions and appears foolish for a few moments. A fool never asks a question and remains a fool all his life. Now the choice is yours." And I've never been afraid to ask a question from that time on. But there's been many things like that, and things that are involved with me. And in fact, when it comes to talking about other people or judging others, we're it's easy for us to do as long as we are not involved. The group I belong to happens to have a member of the group that is a judge. And he told me one time, he said, "You know, this is the easiest job in the world, judging, because you judge other people." And he said, "Because I, as an alcoholic, are great at judging other people. It's just myself I have problems judging." And he said, "You know, that's why this is an ideal setup for alcoholics to become judges, because they're so good at judging others, but lousy when it comes to judging themselves." And this is true, and I found as time went on. And so I thought that this was a good thing to have a sponsor that you could talk to in confidence about anything at all. And as time went on, that proved to be very good, because I say we are emotionally handicapped people, and if there's something involving me, I have got faulty judgment. So I have to ask somebody else that's looking at it clear and unemotionally, and that way I can get steered in the right direction. Now, I don't know how long I've been, but I should give these other folks a chance. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Our next speaker will be Margaret M. from Moorhead.
Hi, my name is Margaret, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Margaret.
I'm from the Moorhead Thursday night group, and when I started coming to Alcoholics Anonymous and they told me to get a sponsor, you know, I looked around, and there was women in that group at the time, and they told me when I was to make a decision about a sponsor, someone that you wanted, they had something that you wanted. And I looked around and you know, and real judgmental and all these women, because it was recommended to me that I get a female sponsor. Males sponsor males and females sponsor females. And so I looked around that room, and really I couldn't find a female that had something I wanted. And I was very honest about that, probably about the only thing I was really honest about at the time. I just didn't find anything. And so I had to ask a male to be my sponsor. And I didn't talk to that sponsor for almost a full year. And the reason being is that I had this warped sense of what a sponsor was for. I thought he or she was a person that told you how to live and what to do on a daily basis, minute by minute. You know, and I thought that he would take away my checkbook and take away my credit cards, and you know, if I was going with somebody, I couldn't go with that person unless it was, he was approved, and you know, so I really had a warped sense of what a sponsor was. I just if I heard, I didn't listen because I didn't want to talk to that person, and so I used that as an excuse. And so it was about the last week of my first year, and finally I started talking to that person, and what I found is that my concept of a sponsor was really off the wall. You know, I thought that we'd have to have sign-up sheets at the Moorhead Thursday night group, and then every weekend you'd go out and pull drunks out of bars, you know, and this was part of your part of being a sponsoree. And what I found is this person, we discussed my problems. And little by little, I learned to trust this person, and he was probably the first person I ever trusted as much as I could at the time. And the more that we talked and the more the relationship grew, the more my trust grew. And pretty soon, you know, instead of my two dogs as my higher power, that's who I had at the beginning when I came into the program, because they were the only two animals I trusted on this earth. I started putting some of that trust in my sponsor. And then pretty soon I started putting trust in my group as a whole. And pretty soon, with the help of my sponsor, I learned how to have a relationship with a higher power. And so this is basically what he's done for me, is just kind of guide me along. If I have a problem and we sit down and we talk about it, and there's, you know, and if he asked me what the consequences are if I do it one way, and if I do it another way, what are the consequences of there? And then sometimes he brings up some consequences that I've never thought about, because I am too emotionally involved in my own life sometimes. I want what I want when I want it, and I get highly emotional, and so I need another person to kind of clear away that emotionalism that I seem to dwell in on a regular basis, and to let me know what the course should be. And so that's basically that's the relationship I've had with my sponsor. And you know, there's different ways of sponsoring. You know, sometimes I've sponsored some people that I've had to take away their checkbook and their credit cards because they just weren't able to handle it. You know, and sometimes we've had to put restrictions on people because they just couldn't handle some things. But you know, it's the relationship you have between two people. You work those things out. And basically that's my concept of a sponsorship, and that's how it's been dealt with me. Thank you.
Okay, I'm happy to welcome our next speaker up, Bob L. from Spokane, Washington.
I'm Bob Lathrop, and I am an alcoholic. Hi, Grace of God Fellowship and both sides of sponsorship have kept me sober since the 22nd of March, '83, and for that I am grateful. And that was not a pause waiting for that, it was trying to think. Damn lucky it was just that short. When I first got in to the fellowship, and at no fault to those around me, because there's plenty of people around me that wanted to help, I was still very defensive, and I still hadn't totally tore down that wall, so I kept people at bay. And I moved to a different city, and when I got there, I was introduced to an individual who started laying laws down on me. And I quickly told him, "You don't understand, my case is different." And he goes, "Okay, but, you know, in the event that you want me to sponsor you, this is what we're going to do." and it's going to entail phone calls. And I said, why phone calls? He says, I need to know you. And through those phone calls, I got to know him. As my life unfolded further on down the road, I was able to have a pivot point to where I could share my joys. And when the cards unfolded and there was disaster in my life, he was there to share my pain. He's also been there not to say, Bob, go over and do that. He said, come here, let's go over here and do something. And he would lead by example. He's never asked me to do anything that he hasn't done himself or is doing himself. He's always right there beside me. He's also my temporary sponsor. I keep telling this guy, I don't want you to get an ego over this, but you're just my temporary sponsor. And he has been for some 12 years now. And I told him just last week, next time I find something better, your history, so watch it. And he said, okay. Earl has done tremendous things for me, or should I say with me. He's walked me through a marriage, and he taught me about dignity. And he walked me through the divorce from that marriage. And he emphasized the dignity we shared earlier we must maintain. And as I struggled to rebuild myself from that divorce, some beautiful things have happened because my dignity was intact, my anger was low. And I met a beautiful lady. And before we were committed to the engagement, I had to take care of my step work with Earl on my last marriage. And he sat down, and there was no judgment, not of me and not of my ex-wife. And that's what I like. What he goes by are the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous, not what he thinks is best. He weighs them against the steps, he weighs them against the traditions, and says, this is how this needs to unfold in your life. And remember, you can't control theirs. When my mother had her stroke, Earl was willing to go to my mom's house and sit with my mom and find out how she was doing. So, I've got an ear. And there's no way I can pay him back for that. And when I ask him about that in so many words, he tells me, just turn around and do the same. So when a guy asks me to sponsor him, it's not that I'm saying you either do this or else. It's our relationship is based on these premises. And once those premises are broke, our relationship is hurt. And we need to take a look at it and reevaluate. And I try and lead by example for those behind me. And because of that, it puts me in some awkward positions where I want to get angry and fight with somebody. I got to be kind and loving. I suppose that has its benefits. But those are the examples that I have to keep walking. They're not always comfortable for the short haul, but in the long haul, they're much more comfortable. Thank you.
All right, our next speaker is going to be Denise.
Hi, I'm Denise, and I'm an alcoholic. Hi, Denise. Wow, it's really a privilege to be sitting up here with you guys. Sponsorship. My first year in the program, I was nuts. I was absolutely nuts. You like the was. Now, my sponsor's sitting at this table, and she's laughing, so maybe it wasn't nuts. I still am. But and during that time, I remember seeing my sponsor, the sponsor I had in Southern California, and she just had, they said, something, they need to have what you want, and at that time, what she did was she had the ability to laugh, and I was so intense, I didn't know how to make anything light at all, and I remember she had all these people, and she was always talking to everybody, and so I thought, God, she has all these people, she won't have time for me, and I go into that and stuff, and I remember I finally got up the courage to ask her, and she had some things, she had me call her every day for 30 days, and I thought, well, that's just crazy, how is she she has all these people and she goes to all these meetings and she has kids and she does all that, how's she going to talk to me? Well, she wasn't going to talk to me every day for 30 days. I just had to make the commitment to practice calling her phone number, and that was hard because commitment has always been a difficult thing for me. There was a period of time that, I would call her and I'd just start going 90 miles an hour, and she'd say, okay, why don't you go take a shower, shave your legs, and call me back? And I'd say, okay, I'm thinking, well, I'll do whatever she says. I go in, I take a shower, I shave my legs, I call her back, and then it's blah, 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 he, them, and all this stuff. And then she'd say, well, why don't you go take another shower and go shave your legs and call me back? Well, about at the fourth time of trying to shave my legs, which was not working at this time, I don't have that much hair, and I finally called her back, and she said, are you willing to listen, and I thought, I wish you would have said that back like at the first time before I, had to take like 2 of those starking cold showers to find out that all it was I needed to listen. And sometimes it took something like that to get my attention. I've been hung up on by my sponsors before, and and I thought, they don't understand me, blah, 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 blah. And then I'd call them back and found out, and it wasn't because they were mean, it was because I was becoming really rude towards them. At that time, and so I had to learn respect. I didn't know how to respect someone else. I had to learn how to listen, and that was really difficult. And my sponsor is never, any of my sponsors, I've had lots of different sponsors. I wish I had had just one that has known me through the whole time, but that has not been my experience. But I do know that I've always needed a sponsor, and I've always had a sponsor. I really believe in the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. My experience has been it really didn't matter many times who my sponsor was. It was the fact that I was taking the action and I was willing to listen to someone else, like people before me were talking about. I met Don for last year when we had this, and I had been talking to him, and I had been looking for a sponsor. I had a difficult time coming from the type of structure I came from, finding a sponsor that went to a lot of meetings and did those kind of things, a woman up here. And so I met Don, and I was talking to Don, and he kept saying, he just kept mentioning Margaret, and I didn't know who that was, and he said something that caught my ear, and really probably the reason I called her was she had something I want. She had been making her bed every day for like lots of years, and I thought, that just was, I was in awe, because that is something I am still incapable of doing. Now that may sound really silly, but in my sobriety, walking into my room with an unmade bed at an end of a day that I felt sorry for myself through that whole day is enough. I could get drunk over it, and in my thinking I thought, wow, that is something I have never ever been able to do, that commitment and consistency, and it was really neat because I was able to call her, and right away I was able to talk to her, and for me that was really difficult. Part of the reason why I had many different sponsors is I have a really hard time trying to find out and learning how to have relationships with other women, and so that was something that is changing. It takes 3,000 miles between us, but it's changing, and it's been wonderful because she leads by example, and I know that she does those things over there, and I keep thinking, well, if she can do it in 30 below degree weather, she can still go to her meeting, I can still go to my meeting, because sometimes that's what helps me show up, and then reaching out to other people becomes a little bit easier. So if you don't have a sponsor, get one, because for me they've always worked. Thanks.
Okay, our next speaker, Mark, has asked me to say that he would like Joe to go first, please.
He must want to correct all the mistakes. Hi, I'm Joe, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Joe.
Sober today by the grace of God and the miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. And for me, I have always had a sponsor. I wish I could have been the sponsoree that a lot of people are. I wish I could have been more of a phone kind of caller. I'd never really gotten a habit of calling my sponsor. I'd seen him once a week, or I'd seen him twice a week, or I'd see him a lot, and I figured I don't need to call. And besides, in those early days, I was more of a giver of snits than a receiver of them. And, my sponsor heard enough about what I was doing from everybody I was hanging around with. They'd call him up and say, Joe did to me today. And, but that's basically how my life went. But I remember sitting there in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous and hearing all this stuff about sponsorship, and I didn't have one. I was pretty new, and nobody would really explain it to me in terms I understood. And I remember these people, they were kind of goofy. They showed up at my meeting. They were a little late. but they were kind of really obnoxiously loud and laughing, and it caught my attention, because I was the doom and gloom guy in the back of the room by the door waiting for the Lord's Prayer to end so I could split. And I turned to go that night, and these guys were standing there. I don't know how they got there that fast. And they asked me to go to coffee. I said no, and then they went home. I don't know what they did. I didn't go to coffee that night. The next week, they brought some short, fat, bald guy with them. And on the way there, he had told them that if he had to knock a guy out and throw him in the trunk, he'd get some new guy to go to coffee. And I was the only new guy. So it was just dumb luck for me, I guess. I remember arguing with the guy why I didn't want to go to coffee, and every time I'd had an argument, he had an answer, and so I wound up going to coffee. And then while we were at coffee, he looked at me, he says, "Hey, what are you doing? 2 weekends from now, we're going to Pierce, South Dakota." And I said, "Oh, nothing." He goes, "Well, you want to go?" I said, "No." And he said, "No, it'll be really fun." I said, "Well, I'm not interested." He says, "It'll be real cheap." And I'm thinking, I just quit drinking. I've got tons of money. Cheap isn't a big thing. He goes, "Oh, you'll meet people from all over the state of South Dakota that we run around with, and there'll be like 30 guys in a hotel room." Now I'm thinking, I really don't need to go on this trip. And, and I went. I pulled my ace out of my pocket, laid it on a table, and I said, "Well, I'd love to go, can't go. I'm in trouble. And the Air Force says I can go to Rapid City and Ellsworth Air Force Base. Pierre just isn't on the list." And he had an answer for that. He just said, "I'm sure if you tell who you're in trouble with, where you're going, why you're going, and who you're going with, they'll let you go." And since I just made it up, I said, "Well, I'll go." And so I went to Pierce, South Dakota, and while I was there, I got there's a new guy without a sponsor treatment. And basically that is every 5 seconds you get inundated with a question of, "Hey, you got a sponsor?" And you say no, and they say, "How long do you want to stay sick?" And then they walk away. They don't even let you give an answer. And, it took about 8 hours of that, and I decided, well, I need to get a sponsor because I'm a little tired of this question. And, stupid me, there's like 8 guys to choose from. I got to choose the guy I can't say no to. And, I remember asking him, "Dave, will you be my sponsor?" And that guy, he must have done about 8 backflips, jumped for joy, and he said, "I'd be glad to." I think what he heard was, "Would you like to take complete control of the rest of my life?" And he said, be wonderful, be glad to do it. And he set me down, and he gave me some direction, and he pointed the way out in Alcoholics Anonymous, and he told me things, and he shared to me about the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the things that he shared with me were true. And unfortunately for my first sponsor, he wasn't quite able to live up to the standards that he had said, and he became a victim of himself pretty much. And unfortunately, I don't know if he's still going to meetings or not, but I remember the day I fired him. I just remember that day like it was yesterday, and the look he had on his face. And I thought, God, when I asked him to be my sponsor and became his friend, and the things I shared with that man, that is not how I wanted it to end. And that's unfortunately the way things go in this program. And, I fired him, and I got his sponsor for a sponsor, and that worked for a while, but I'm just not the kind of guy that picks up the phone enough. And, the relationship, if you're, thousands of miles apart and you're not calling the guy, it's not working. And so I decided I needed somebody that I would be able to see and talk to on a regular basis. And I searched out the meeting places around here and have got a sponsor here. The thing for me that I know about sponsorship, and I guess the best analogy I could think of in my own mind is in reference to a sailboat and what a sponsor's job is in reference to a sailboat. And for me, it's not the sail that catches the wind. He's not the rudder that steers the direction I'm going to go in. And to me, he's just the keel, and that's probably the most important part of the sailboat. It's the part that keeps you upright in the water. And for me, it's I have the ability to do what I want, when I want, to who I want. I remember my sponsor, that was my first sponsor. Every time I'd ask him something, he'd say, "Oh, just go do what you want. You will anyway." And just to make him mad, I'd do what he said, just so, I'll show him. But, it's always been a thing with me to have a sponsor. It's not always been a thing with me to use a sponsor. And, then again, I've sponsored a lot of guys, and I haven't met the guy that's called me all the time. But I do have a friend in Rapid City that uses his sponsor quite well. I wish I could have used mine as much as he does. But he's the guy that was always calling, saying, "What Joe's doing to me?" And, it's a tremendous thing. To have this deal and to be in it long enough to make long-term friendships. And I believe the only reason I'm here tonight is because that short, fat, bald guy once said to me, "If you're so smart, what are you doing here in the basement of this church talking to me on a Thursday night?" And I've been sober a little over 10 years. I still don't have an answer for that, but thanks.
Next is Mark O. from Renton, Washington.
Thank you. My name's Mark, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Mark.
And I'm sober today by the grace of God, the miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. And yeah, I wanted to make sure Joe got it right. And, but sponsorship is absolutely critical to me because I can remember the first time I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, and the first time I got to Alcoholics Anonymous was a long time ago. And I got in through a treatment center, and as I walked out the doors of that treatment center, they suggested that I go to AA meetings and that I get a sponsor. And so I went to an AA meeting, and I asked the guy to be my sponsor, and he said yes, and that was the last time I ever talked to him. And I went to AA meetings when I felt like it and where I felt like it, and a while later I was, amazingly enough, struck drunk, and 7.5 years later I ran into this group of guys. And I can remember sitting in a newcomers meeting trying to explain to them why I should get credit for the time I had been around Alcoholics Anonymous. And somebody asked me that question. They said, well, if you're so smart and you've learned so much, what are you doing here now? And I didn't have an answer for that. And they asked me that question. They said, do you have a sponsor? And I said no. And they said, how long do you want to have an idiot in charge of your life? And they let me think about that for about 30 seconds, and then they gave me the definition of a resentment and ran off and left me. And but they were asking me about having a sponsor, and these guys were hauling me around in meetings and things, and they were really doing the things in Alcoholics Anonymous that we're taught to do. And they kept on me about a sponsor, and I'm really grateful for that, because one night they were putting on a meeting in Pennington County Jail. And they had invited me along. I didn't know where we were going. They just showed up and took me places. And we were sitting in Pennington County Jail, and they're putting on a meeting for the prisoners there. And it occurs to me there's a warrant out for my arrest, and this is a real bad place for me to be. Maybe I should have a sponsor. And so I got a sponsor, and the first thing my sponsor had me do was the last thing I wanted to do, and that was to go talk to the sheriff. But I did it, and things worked out well. But it became real important for me to learn how to talk to a sponsor, because I had never been honest with another human being in my life, period. Just hadn't happened. And that sponsor was the first human being that I trusted enough to be totally honest with him. And unfortunately, like Joe talked about, that sponsor, for whatever reasons, he did teach me that what we have today is a spiritual reprieve contingent upon what we do today. And then I think he proved it, because he quit doing it on a daily basis. And I was fortunate. I had a sponsor that had a sponsor, and I went to that sponsor, and I've had that sponsor ever since. My first sponsor taught me about consistency. I went through a divorce when I first got sober, one of many things I went through. And I left town for economic reasons, and I needed to pay child support. But he taught me consistency, and he taught me that I needed to talk to those kids on a regular and consistent basis. So every week for the last 10 years, I've talked to those kids, and pretty much every week for the last 10 years, I've made that phone call to my sponsor. I also learned along the way that I have a hearing problem. I don't always hear what my sponsor says. Sometimes it comes through that filter, and I don't hear directions as clearly as I should. But and he got me involved in Alcoholics Anonymous, and we've walked through a lot of stuff together. When I lost that first sponsor, I was able to see when he got back from where he had been that it wasn't working anymore, and we had to part company, and I'd been using his sponsor while he was gone, and so there really wasn't a ripple in the water. But they got me involved in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I got involved in working with new people, and I got involved with sponsoring people, and that put me in the middle of Alcoholics Anonymous. And then when the few ripples that have come along when I've been sober have come along, I've been able to stay in the middle of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I haven't had to go anywhere, and that's from having a sponsor and being a sponsor. And keeps me out of myself most of the time. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is from Helena, Montana, Lee.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lee, and I am an alcoholic. Hi, Lee. Sober today by the living grace of God and the miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. This is a tough act to follow here. But the first thing that I would like to do is I would like to thank the committee for asking me to come here and talk. And anyway, you know, if I can just briefly touch on what it was like for me prior to coming to Alcoholics Anonymous. I was very irresponsible. I was very selfish and self-centered, egotistical. I had a lot of living problems. I didn't really have a drinking problem. I was drinking all the time. But I had a lot of severe living problems. And by the way, I had those problems even before I started drinking alcohol. And if I can quote something from the Alateen book that states that many of the symptoms of alcoholism are found in the behavior of the alcoholic, and it does not matter how much or what we drink, but why we drink and what happens when we take a drink. You know, in my drinking days, I was always trying to compare how I drank to how other people drank, and in the beginning, it was easy for me to point the finger at Joe and say, no, I don't have the problem, it's Joe that's got the problem. He drinks more than I do. Toward the end of my drinking, it was really difficult for me to point the finger. And then, I love this, my sponsor was telling me after I got sober, he says, you know, when you point the finger, you've got 3 fingers pointing back at you. Anyway, what happened for me was I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. This was the last place I thought I'd end up. And I started attending meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'd go to the meeting at 8 o'clock. The meeting would end at 9, and I sat in the back by the door so I could make a hasty escape, because I was sure that these people were going to attack me or confront me or do something terrible to me, and I didn't want any part of that. But I can say today that I'm very grateful that there was some people there that were pretty fast on their feet too, because I eventually got cornered and was asked to go out to coffee also. And the people in the meetings that I was attending then were very persistent and consistent as far as asking me about having a sponsor. And I got sick of hearing that question too, and so I thought, well, you know, I better ask somebody to be my sponsor. But I had no idea what that was either. You know, I was thinking that maybe that was somebody that was going to give me financial support until I got on my feet or something, because I really could have used that at the time. But you know, later on in my recovery, I was given the definition of a sponsor. What they were saying was that this is someone who you will eventually come to know, like, and trust, and it is someone who you will walk the walk with and talk the talk with. You know, it was real important for me to get a sponsor because I had made such a big mess out of running my life. And, you know, if I was doing such a great job, like you already heard here, what was I doing in Alcoholics Anonymous? And so, but one of the hardest lessons in my recovery that I had to learn was that I needed to try to start to live under someone else's care and direction. And for me, that started with sponsorship. Prior to that, even though I was going to meetings, my life was not very good. In fact, I was more miserable then than I was when I was drinking. So I would not suggest trying to do this thing called Alcoholics Anonymous without a sponsor. I tried that. I didn't go back to drinking, but I should have been, probably. I would have been much happier, probably. Anyway, you know, I don't want to make this too long. Another thing that I have learned from the sponsor that I have today is that as a child, I was very dependent on my parents to clothe and feed me. The next stage of development is called independent, where my mother came to me and said, let me tie your shoes, and I said, no, I can do it myself. But the next stage of development is called interdependency. This is where normal non-alcoholic people enter into that stage where they become responsible enough for other people to depend on them, and but they also realize that it's okay to depend on other people for certain things. Well, by the time I quit drinking, I was still independent, you know, and I knew nothing about being interdependent. So anyway, I'm just very grateful to be here and be a part of this thing. So keep coming back, get a sponsor.
All right, I believe that we've got a list of questions, or if anyone has any questions, you want to throw those on up here, Steve? And if anyone has any questions that, you know, they have, feel free to ask. Okay, great. Thank you. The first question on here is, how soon can you be a sponsor? Or, how soon can you sponsor? It's the first question on here. And who wants to take that one? Denise, would you like to?
Sure. Hi, I'm Denise. I'm an alcoholic. Do we keep saying their name? Okay. Okay. Actually, that's a good question for me. I was told after my second meeting, I got my sponsor like right off the bat, and well, actually, I was sponsored by a bunch of blue-haired ladies, actually, and they told me right at the very beginning that I could walk up after I'd been to my first meeting. I could walk up to someone that it's their very first meeting, and I had something to give away because I knew what it was like to have one day more than them, or get through that first meeting, or do those kind of things. So I was taught very early that it was really important that I turn around and give away right away. My first sponsoree, I was, I think, 6 months in the program. Someone asked me, and I almost passed out. And so I ran to fight. I said, I don't know, is what I said. And I went and I asked my sponsor, and my sponsor said, yeah. And I said, but you don't understand. I'm just going to mess up this person's life. I mean, her life is going to be so bad, and I'm so crazy. Blah, blah. And she just looked at me and smiled. And then I went back and I said, yes, I would be happy to. It's a privilege. And then I think I went in the bathroom and threw up. And then, so I had her do what my sponsor did with me. And all I did, and there were times she would call me, and I kind of feel sorry for her. She was very much a guinea pig. She would call me, and I'd say, you know, I got to do something real quick. I'll call you right back. And I'd call my sponsor, and she asked me, like, you know, should she read the big book? Or, you know, I mean, I would just panic on everything. And my sponsor was really getting sick and tired of it. So I noticed that my sponsor was talking to her a lot after meetings, probably just to reassure her that, you know, life would be okay. But, you know, she's still sober. And she probably has 9.5 years today, if she still is. Last time I heard, she was still sober. So the other thing I learned to do, I don't think it's too early. I do believe, though, I had no right to sponsor someone if I wasn't being sponsored, because I was taught you can't give away what you don't have. And so I had to just make sure, like it talks about in the big book, that, you know, my house was in order. And in order for me to do that, I had to make sure I didn't say go to meetings and then I, you know, decided to go out to dinner with my friends instead. So, thanks.
Thanks, Denise. Okay, I'll direct this next question to you, Don. The question is, who was Bill W.'s first sponsor?
As far as I know, my name is Don, and I'm an alcoholic still. And as far as I know, Bill's first sponsor, it was a case of co-sponsoring. He and Dr. Bob worked together a great deal. And Ebby Thatcher was the first contact that Bill had, but Ebby kept on slipping, unfortunately. And but from what I know of it and what I've seen of it in the past, it was Dr. Bob was Bill's sponsor.
Okay, this next statement in question. My sponsor and I have been working together for 10 years. Sometimes it seems we are more friends than sponsor-sponsee. Do I need another sponsor? And I'll go ahead and ask you this one again, Don, if you'd like to.
Well, as time goes on, of course, as we grow in the fellowship, we don't require the same amount of sponsorship, the same degree. We don't have daily problems we have to call about. And very often what happens is the relationship changes to become close friends. And in my case, unfortunately, because of my age, all my early sponsors have all died, and that's why I've had to get new sponsors. And but often they, as I say, they become very close friends, and they know each other very well, and they sort of just go back and forth with each other. And it all depends on the relationship.
Okay. Bob Lathrop on the next one. Bob.
I guess I'm very fortunate. After 12 years, I've developed a relationship that's based on honesty and trust. And we have an open and honest relationship both ways. And Earl has never been afraid to tell me I've crossed a line. But on the same note, he's never been afraid to put his arm over my shoulder when he's hurting or when I'm hurting, just for that mutual help that somehow comes when one alcoholic puts an arm around the other in support. I am real lucky with that, and I don't think a new sponsor is, in my case, is a requirement, because Earl keeps it pretty much on the balance, as I try to as well.
Let me just ask, is there anyone else that wants to respond to this last question? I'll go ahead and open that format up for the remainder of this meeting. The next question on here, is there anything in the first 164 pages about sponsorship? And I'll go ahead and have Mark answer this one if you'd like, and then anyone else who would like to respond.
And now we find out what the truth is.
I don't have it memorized. My name's Mark, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Mark.
And I don't have it memorized, but sorry. Asked the wrong guy. But yeah, there is, but I can't remember exactly where it is in there. You'll have to talk to somebody better versed on the book than I am. I do go through the big book with the guys I do sponsor now. That's one thing I have changed as I've gone along sponsoring people. In the beginning, it was just kind of a hit and miss, and we just kind of ran around and did a lot of things together. And now we sit down and we go through the big book very slowly and very carefully. Besides, we go to a lot of book studies together. But yes, it does talk about sponsorship in the big book. But page number, I don't know. Thank you.
Is there anyone else that wants to respond to that? I'm not sure myself. All right. Okay, the next question. What about multiple sponsors is the question. And that's having more than one sponsor. So let me call Margaret up here for this question.
Hi, Margaret. I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Mark.
Geez, I'd love to have a sponsor for each of my personalities, you know. Had about 10 of them, I think, at last count. I was told that, this deal about sponsorship to me, now this is my own personal opinion, but see, I don't use a sponsor like I talk to a girlfriend. I want some firm direction. I really don't want a lot of chit-chat about it when I ask my sponsor a question and we sit there and discuss it. It's not like a gab session. And, I'd love to walk around and talk to 85 people until I find that one person that will agree with what really I want to do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best course of action for me. It's probably what I would like to do, but it's not necessarily the right thing to do. And so when I go talk to my sponsor, before I go in there, I haven't made up my mind what I'm going to do yet. I used to do that when I first started, and then I'd kind of half listen to what they said, because I knew I was going to do what I wanted to do anyway. And of course, over time, I got into more and more trouble doing that, and finally, something clicked up here and said, for God's sakes, either go with an open mind or don't go. And so that's what I had to do. I had to have a change of attitude on myself that I was going to this person talking about this stuff, and when the agreement at the end was this is the way I should do this or proceed with a problem, then that's the course I would take. And so, I couldn't handle one more sponsor. And I don't think my sponsor could handle me having more than one either. He doesn't have the time. Neither do I. It'd take us too long. Thank you.
Anyone else want to respond to that? The next question on here. What do you feel the responsibilities of a sponsor are not? And again, what do you feel the responsibilities of a sponsor are not? And I'll just pass this one down to Lee.
My name is Lee, and I am an alcoholic. I would just like to say that there's an excellent pamphlet out. It's questions and answers on sponsorship that goes into great detail about this particular question. And gives some, I do believe it gives some direct answers to that. Thanks.
Okay, the next question on here. When and how should you call a sponsee when you haven't heard from them in weeks? When and how should you call a sponsee when you haven't heard from them in weeks? That's a good question. How about Joe?
I gotta ask. Hi, I'm Joe, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Joe.
As you heard earlier, I'm not very good on the telephone, so if you got me for a sponsor and you're looking for that phone call, it might not happen. I take it from my own personal experience. The only time my sponsor ever called me is if he had something specifically for me to do. Like I lived in town in Rapid City. He lived at Crazy Horse, which was about 40 miles away. And if he was at home and he needed something, sometimes he'd call him and say, "Hey, can you go do this for me?" And I'd say, "Yeah, sure," if I wasn't doing anything. But I don't ever remember my sponsor ever calling me up saying, "Hey, what are you doing? I haven't seen you for a while." And I don't ever personally remember ever calling somebody up and saying, "Hey, I haven't seen you for a while. What you up to?" But I do know that I've seen several people that have asked me to sponsor them after a long period of time back at a meeting, and I always ask them how things are going and where they've been, and to try to be not so much condescending upon them, but just to find out what they've been up to and see if there's any help I might be able to assist them with. I don't personally believe if you don't want this deal that I should track you down and make you take it. I've seen too many people just come and go, and they told me early on, work with the ones that are still here and try to find some new ones.
Anyone else want to respond to that?
The goof from Louisville told me that he was only going to give me 3 phone calls. He said after that, it's no longer a program of attraction. It's a program of promotion. He said after 3 phone calls, if they want it, they'll pick it up.
Okay, the next question on here. How do we go about choosing the right sponsor that will work for us newcomers? Let me make sure there's no more to that one. Okay. Again, how do we go about choosing the right sponsor that will work for us newcomers? And let's see. Don, would you like to answer that one? How to choose a sponsor? How to choose the right sponsor?
Well, sometimes how to choose the right sponsor, it depends on the group you're in, how many people are in the group. It varies across the country. There's tremendous changes in Alcoholics Anonymous, and we have to adapt to the change as we go along. But usually somebody who's been sober for quite a while longer than I have, it would be a good sponsor for me. Because the thing is, I'm getting an outsider's point of view, because my own personal view is very narrow because I'm emotionally involved in the situation. But anybody outside of myself could see it much clearer. The only time they have problems if it's them that has the problem. They don't see it, but that's really just another person's help and seeing it from a different viewpoint, really. So. I think that's all there is to it. It doesn't really matter.
By the way, these are great questions. I'm impressed with these. I've been to some other panels like this, and not near this many questions were asked, so I'm really impressed with the next and final question. With sponsees that are sober a long time, for example, 15 to 20 years, do you feel you are no longer needed and should leave them alone with no phone calls, etc.? Margaret?
Hi, Margaret again, an alcoholic.
Hi, Margaret.
Well, I guess sponsorees, okay. Well, the people my sponsorees that I've had for a number of years, we've over the years developed a friendship. And this is the way of how we look at it. And we kind of co-sponsor each other after a while, because we went through the happy road, or we trudged the road to happy destiny together. After that many years, it's kind of a maintenance thing. So when we get together, we talk about, if I'm having a problem or she's having out that if she has a problem about something, we just kind of discuss it. And after that many years, it's a kind of a different relationship than when you first started. Because when you first start, you have to build a real trust. And if you stay with a person that long, there is a bond there, a trust, and some respect, and so it's. I don't leave them alone, to be perfectly honest, because after that many years, there is something more, and we know each other, and we get along together, and we have some common interests other than Alcoholics Anonymous. I guess it doesn't matter to me how many years it is. People are people, and problems do crop up, and we all need help along the way. And I don't know if I answered that question, but I don't think years have really anything to do with it. Thank you.
Well, that's all there is on the questions here. And again, those were great questions. We're winding down here. Let's see. I have some announcements that I would like to read, and while I'm doing this, we're self-supporting through our own contributions. If I could have our